Hello, once again. This is David Panush with the Edmund Burke School. This is a video lecture for Stumbling on Happiness by Dan Gilbert. We are in Chapter 4, Realism, Part 1. All right, this chapter is all about using our imagination. So, what is the problem with using your imagination? Well, when you want to make a decision about the future, what is it that you usually do? You say, do I want to go out to dinner with my friends or do I want to stay home and do my homework? And then you imagine what it would be like to do both things, have the imaginary options in your head, and choose the one that you think is going to be the best based on your imagination. Seems like a good plan, but it's not. The imagination that you rely on is made of our memories. In other words, how do I know what it's like to go out with my friends? Well, I know what it was like the last time I went out with them. It relies on perception. So I take in things from the world, and that is how I make sense of it. And it relies on this idea of realism, which is, generally speaking, we believe whatever we think. And so we believe that the thing that we've imagined is actually pretty accurate and pretty high fidelity, when in fact it is not. So that means that the choice we're making is based off of a fiction. All right, to start with, memory. Human memory is not a video recorder or an audio recorder or any kind of recorder. Human memory is a impression recorder, is a abstract recorder. And what we do is we experience the world, and then when we're asked to remember it, we kind of just make guesses. We put together what we think we remember with what we feel like we should remember, or what we think we thought the last time, and we sort of fill in all the gaps. And this is this idea in the chapter about the filling in trick. So there are lots of gaps in our memory, and our brain fills them in. And it does it without telling us, so that our memory seems more accurate than it really is. Also, once we remember something once, if we are then asked to recall it a second time, we change the story. The story of our memories actually changes over time. In fact, the more times you are asked to recall a memory, the more likely it is to change. It's sort of like a game of telephone with yourself. So the first time you remember it, it might be one thing. The second time you remember it, one little element changes, then another little element changes, and eventually the memory is pretty unreliable. And unfortunately, we're not really aware of all these filling ins and unreliabilities of our memory. And remember, memory is what we use to imagine things. Secondly, we use perception to make up how we imagine the world. So this is the filling in trick part 2, which is there are millions of bits of information coming into all 5 of our senses at any one moment, and we can only pay attention to like 60 of those bits, which is why you can follow one conversation but not 2. So like following a conversation requires a certain amount of bandwidth in your perception. Following 2 conversations overloads the bandwidth. You can't really do it. And your brain, therefore, doesn't really, even though it may be all these things are coming in, you can only perceive a small little tunnel of everything that's coming in. So what your brain does in the background is it sort of, again, fills in the background. It fills in the gaps, right? And this optical illusion is a good example. In the sense that like you're trying to make sense of what you're perceiving, and your brain is doing all kinds of tricks to do it, and it's creating a reality for you because we like that, but it's not necessarily an accurate. It's not necessarily accurate. Period. So. Just like our memory is not a recording, neither is our perception. What we perceive is not actually all that it is. And again, as with memories filling in, our perception fills in all these gaps without us being aware. Realism, this is a little bit tricky. If you read about it in the book, it is a little bit difficult to understand what he's trying to say, but basically it's the idea that your perception is reality. For the most part, most people think that what they perceive is actually accurate. And of course, thinking from an evolutionary standpoint, like, again, most of the time that's true in the ways that really matter. Like, is that a lion? Is it not a lion? I think it's a lion. If I guess wrong, it's not. If I guess wrong, I'm dead. So let me just think it's a lion and run, right? And so most of the time we just perceive without knowing that we're not perceiving very accurately, and we believe. So this is the problem with realism, it's the believing part. The other problem with our perception of reality is that we tend to make the mistake of believing that whatever we perceive is the same exact thing that everyone else perceives, that it's objective, when of course, in fact, it's always going to be subjective. Two different people, even standing next to each other, looking at the same thing, see it at slightly different angles. And they may both say that they're like looking at the water pitcher, but they're seeing slightly different things. So not only is it a constructed reality that we believe is true, we don't just believe it's true for us, we tend to believe it's true for everybody. And in fact, neither of these things are true. Perception is not reality, and reality is subjective, not objective. So how does this all figure into our problems using imagination? So the problem is we use our imagination to make choices, and as we do so, the stuff of imagination is based on our memory. It's based on our perception, which we now know are not too reliable. It's also biased by this idea that it must be real, and that it must be the same for everybody. And all of this is happening below the level of consciousness so that we believe in the accuracy of our imagination, when in fact we should not. So the mistake is that we treat whatever we imagine as an objective reality and then make a decision accordingly. Therefore, our decisions are based on faulty information or bad information. So therefore, we should not be super surprised when sometimes our decisions don't turn out the way we thought, because we had to use our imagination to weigh the options, and in fact, the experience isn't exactly as we imagined it. That's it. All right, see you next time.